All right, so this lecture is going to cover social justice advocacy. So I broke this up into two parts. The first part is what we're going to cover about what social justice advocacy is. We're going to revisit the topic of social justice and what it boils down to. And then we're going to cover uh, what liberation is considered to be and uh, how can we develop a consciousness towards liberation and ultimately providing us with like a basis for social justice advocacy. So when we talked about social justice, right, we recognize that it's there's different definitions for different people, right? And within psychology, something that we've realized is that it's really under theorized, right? Um, if we're not able to really capture it, we can't really, number one, measure it. And when we can't measure it, we're not able to provide training or even explain how we conceptualize social justice and psychology. When we're looking at it very specifically, there's multiple meanings. With each of these meanings, there's a lack of development in definitions. And then lastly, there's like a lack of consensus among psychologists about the best definition of social justice. But the thing about social justice, what it really boils down to is fairness, right? So with each definition that we talked about in the Introduction to Identities lecture, right, what it all boiled down to was fairness amongst and between members of different groups. So when we think about fairness, right, we have to talk about the ways in which we can move towards this place of fairness, right? And we're going to talk about liberation, and liberation is a way of providing us to not only achieve that fairness, but to change the way these systems operate. So the thing about liberation, though, it's a challenge for everybody. It's something that is, it can't be given, it has to be created. Uh, so the book goes on to talk about liberation politics. And with liberation politics, um, there's several things that it aims to achieve. Changing hearts and minds, developing empathy and sympathy for others, um, helping others to discover that we are all connected, right? And with liberation politics, the main end game is to recognize that the interconnections between peoples can result in collaborative efforts to create democratic values, discourse, and institutions. So when we look on the life that we currently are living in, right, it's really complicated. We recognize the different ways in which different oppressions are operating for different people. So what we're starting to see now is the raising the question of, are people who are engaging in social justice advocacy are doing it out of righteousness or out of genuine concern? So what I'm really referring to is people who consider themselves as allies, engaging in behavior not because of the genuine concern in relation to that oppression, but because there's a component of wanting to show that this person can do the work, that this person that they can that they are the ones doing the liberation. When if you look at it from that standpoint, that's more so about clout, more so about power, compared to it being a genuine concern. And it creates this question of, where does our morality lie? One way of thinking about liberation is that we all came from we all came on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. So when we think about this moral imperative, right, where does our morality lie? For some folks, it's about um, helping each other make those connections to show how we're all interconnected, and that we belong in a community. So taken together, when we're looking at these different marginalizations, right, these different um, these different oppressions, they're very much different, and at the same time, they are interconnected in some way, shape, or form, right? The main thing that connects them is this component of domination. So when we're looking at it, while a person of color is experiencing not only racist oppression, they may also be experiencing classist oppression, right? They may also be experiencing heterosexist oppression. The point is, each of these different oppressions are connected. And with these different oppressions, right, they drive disconnections, right? And disconnection drives isolation. And what we've seen with isolation, right, there are different expressions of it. Isolation just is not only expressed in forms of depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. It may also be expressions of violence, hatred, and bigotry. So taken together, these expressions not only are evidence of isolation, but it also reinforces uh, or really maintains disconnection. And if it maintains disconnection, it also maintains oppression. So really, it's a big loop here. It's a big feedback system. So what is the solution? Well, if we're isolated, if we're disconnected from people, then the solution would be genuine human connection, building upon common humanity. Um, so really, the end game of liberation is providing a way of having people experience authentic human connection, engaging in the hearts and minds of others, and how to heal these injuries that we all have suffered from these oppressions, as well as how are we going to organize um, ways to that transforms people as well as institutions. So when we're thinking about our visions, right? When we're thinking about visions for change, it's really important for us to rethink our strategies and tactics. And we have to think about where we're going as we're moving through this social justice advocacy, right? Um, when we look at our current politics, right? Our current political system, you have you basically have you have one side that is the quote unquote left, and the other side that is quote unquote right. And what we've seen in the media is that they're bashing heads against each other. They're struggling for power. And this creates this question of, are we going to continue to struggle for power where only one side wins? And if we're going to continue on with that way, and I say we, then we've already lost, because once again, if we're trying to disrupt a system of domination in this particular struggle for power, right? Power is really important in domination. And if we're continuing to struggle for that power, we're risking the chances of continuing that domination. If we're going to continue for that struggle, and when we attain power, we will also maintain domination. So the current way that we're working right now is, the question is, are we moving towards uh, more justice, more connection, or are we moving towards more domination? So when we think about these political instances, right, where there is loss, our victory, when we feel that sense of loss in our victory sometimes, um, there is something to be learned when our victory feels like defeat, right? Um, when we think about moving to action, right? Uh, are we moving people to action? Are we moving people, are not moving, but are we listening to the spirit? And I'm not talking about religious beliefs. Are we really speaking to that person? Um, so, taken together, what we really need to think about is redefining what we consider to be quote unquote winning, right? Most people think winning is getting people to see, uh, to moving people to action, right? Moving people towards a oppressive oppressive way of thinking compared to allowing them that opportunity to start um, their own actions towards liberation. So when we think about transformational politics, right? Let me go back. So when we think about transformational politics, it's political work that changes the hearts and the minds of people, and it also supports personal and group growth in ways that provide um, healthy and whole folks, organizations and communities, and it's based on a society where people are supported by institutions and communities to live their best lives. When we think about community, when we think about it, some questions that we should ask: where should we build it? Should it be geographic? Should it be based on identity, organizational or work identity, right? Um, where are the places that community happens? Well, when we think about community, community can just be about a large group of people who are bonded together over time through common interest and concern, through responsibilities, accountability, and commitment to friendship and love. It's more than just geographic identity, so forth and so on. We see there's that common interest. Now, to build and live with an authentic community, several things need to happen. Oops. So, with building an authentic community, there has to be a deeper level of caring and interaction that um, that is authentic, instead of this drive for individualism and self-fulfillment. And I want to be clear, that is really hard when we're in a society that values individualism um, and being your own person. That's hard to do. And really, it's hard because it's calling for communal values. So some things that we think about, right, when we think about kids, for example, or children, um, you know, when what the what the right calls traditional family values works against the quoted the often very oftenly quoted African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And this particular quote, it speaks to the communal value of the importance of every um, every child in the life of that community, which is in the present and the future. So they point to, having that value points to a very different solution as compared to the political rights values of related to traditional family values, right? Um, so what we see with the right, we see the values as solutions for the problems of youth alienation, crime, and violence. And and within US America, instead of providing more policing and building more jails with these values, we might want to start looking for ways in which community can be responsible and accountable for others, especially kids who are in the present and of the future. It's also about seeing the whole picture and not just the parts of it. Um, oops, go back. So even bigger than that, it's also understanding how these parts and even the whole are related to each other. And that it's difficult too with moving into building an authentic community because uh, you have, as an individual, you have needs and the group has needs. So it's really making sure that you can balance between identity and freedom and the collective good and public responsibility. Now, one big thing and something that's really, really important and something that I've seen people do is um, it's really important to build and be authentic um, in your relationships. What I've seen people engage in liberation work, and they are not authentic. Uh, they're not genuine. So, what I mean by being authentic, it's being able to bring all of who we are to the relationship. So it's being a neighbor to your neighbor, friend to friend, worker to worker, whatever relationship that you have, it's being genuine, being authentic in that relationship. So with this particular um, with this particular uh, element, it's moving, working across great differences uh, in culture, lifestyle, and your beliefs. And it's demanding that you look beyond your own stuff, beyond your own lives to understand the lives of others. So it's really, in a nutshell, it's reaching out and being okay with reaching out and having your full hand extended forward to that other person. So one way of being able to do that is asking people who they are. So when we start, or whenever I started in college, what we tended to do to get everybody to know each other is like say your name and your major. Okay. And that was like boring. That was boring as hell. Yet instead, uh, one of my teachers, one of my public health teacher, instead, it was say your name, uh, your year, your major, and the type of music you liked and why, or your favorite song. I think it was a favorite song. Regardless, it was a song, right? It was something with like music. And I got to learn a lot more about people and I got to connect with people when I knew, when I heard when I heard their stuff. So the point is, it's moving beyond number one, the standard, and it's moving beyond yourself. And a lot of times, and for students, they're like, oh shit, this icebreaker. Well, we live in a culture where we're not allowed to share about who we are. And this is based in part of this individualistic system. I say system, but culture. And I want to be clear, in doing liberation work, it's important to know who you are and to be able to share who you are in doing the work in creating these relationships. It may also be about asking about lifelines. So uh, it may be for some people in some groups, maybe in some LGB communities or safe spaces, might be sharing coming out stories. Um, Women activists and housing projects in New Orleans, they may get to know each other by telling like their lifelines, the major events that shape them along their way. So it's really about getting to know that the point is, in this long-winded way, getting to know someone beyond what beyond just the simple stuff. It means going deep. It may also be storytelling. So here's some questions up here to ask yourself when you're working on building a community or when you find yourself in a community. So I'll leave this up for a minute just for you to reflect. Okay. So now we're going to get into political integrity and multi-issue politics. So it's one thing for us to talk about liberation politics. It's another part of having to live them. So what we tend to do, and something that I've noticed, and even myself, I've noticed that I've done, lack political integrity when when we start demanding for liberation for one cause or one group of people and act out oppression and exploitation towards others. So basically, saying we demand liberation of all women, and at the same time deliver microaggressions to women of color, LGBT folks, folks who are transgender, right? And so basically, you're talking out one side of your mouth, and you're bullshit. You're talking out both ends of your mouth. You're saying something, you're doing something when you're saying something, but you're doing something different. Okay. So when we don't analyze that, it gets really easy to fall into this singular identity. It gets really easy to fall into fighting for only one oppression, but continuing to perpetuate another. So when we think about creating a multiracial, multicultural, multi-issue version of liberation, that is not easy, right? So what we tend to do, something that I've noticed within the liberation work, and even I've done it myself, talking about diversity and endorsing beliefs and identity politics rather than talking about shared power, and at the same time not even any visions for change. So let me get into diversity politics and identity politics. Hopefully it'll make it easier to understand it, because when we talk about when we talk about diversity politics and identity politics, they tend to be very broad, very confusing. So I'll do my best to break it down. So diversity politics is basically the set of beliefs and this position on the necessity for having everyone present and treated well in any given setting. So the core premise of it is that all oppression is equal and that everyone is oppressed. So when we're looking at this, it's basically having diversity for the sake of diversity. And one of the most popular images of diversity politics is having people holding hands around America, right, and singing "We Are the World." Shout out to Michael Jackson to some extent, right? I still struggle with it. But the point is we hear these messages about one love, right? And typically what you see people of various identities holding hands and saying, "We are the world. Look at us. We're so diverse. This is great." Well, here's the thing about diversity politics. It doesn't really deal with the power dynamics of differences and even shifting the balance. Instead, it's very superficial. It addresses the problem in a way that is not analytical and transformational. Now, identity politics This is something that we typically hear in the political media. Identity politics is basically the set of beliefs that brings people together who share a single common identity. The goal of identity politics, very broadly, is to eliminate a single oppression, one that is based on the common identity. The thing about identity politics is that it's very limited in its hierarchical approach. So what this means is that with identity politics, what it tends to do is it focuses only on one type of oppression, and that is the primary, and then it moves to another type of oppression based on another identity. So as a black woman who is also non-religious, I would have to choose, and also a vegan, I would have to identify which identity is salient is salient enough for me to identify as the primary identity, and as a result figuring out which oppression is like the is the major oppression that I want to get rid of. So in essence, I have to choose which identity I pick. And leading to the next point, failure to acknowledge the same multiplicity of oppressions. So when we think about intersectionality, right, we talk about intersectional oppressions typically with women of color, and even with men of color, there's these experiences of gendered racism. So this intersectional oppression that is not only based on gender, it's also based on race. And so with identity politics, it's basically saying you can only pick one or the other. It's basically like if you went to the store and you're like, Ma, can I have the Twix and can I have the Skittles? And your mom's like, it's one or the other. And God forbid you ask if you want McDonald's, because you ask if you have McDonald's money. The point is, you have to pick and choose with this particular identity politics. Now, I do want to be clear, there are some positive aspects of identity politics. There is clarity of single focus in tactics and strategies. There's a self-examination and education apart from dominant cultures. You also see the development of solidarity and group bonding and the creation of organizations. Now, the thing about identity politics, where it tends to lead us down into the rabbit hole is, or really just overall, right, with diversity and identity politics is, are we going to work on one issue or multi-issues? So I want y'all to think about that for a minute. All right, so what I do want to be clear is that there are pros and cons for working on a singular issue and multi-issues, right? When we think about when the discourse is talking about multi-issues, people worry that it's going to spread us too thin if we do our best to work on everyone's issues, and ours will fall by the wayside. Now, in the external work, so if you're doing anti-violence work, working against police brutality, seeking government funding for AIDS research, you don't have to work on quote unquote everybody's issues. You can be focused. Now, the thing about that is, how are we going to get to true social change if we don't look all within like the constituency who is affected by a certain issue, right? So when we think about, for example, AIDS, right? We know that we know that HIV can transition into AIDS, right? And AIDS is a very debilitating physical disorder, right? And the thing about AIDS is that people of every race, class, gender, um, demographic, location, right? They, it doesn't discriminate. However, what we find is that much of the research and services that are sought, people of color are often overlooked. Women are also overlooked, right? And when we think about it, if we're looking at it um, from an intersectional point of view, women of color are often overlooked. Gay folks of color are also overlooked, right? Transgender folks of color are also overlooked. So the point is, when we focus on a singular issue, there's people that are overlooked. And so taken together, to leave any group out leaves a hole for people's freedoms and rights to really fall through. And then it ends up being what is acceptable and not acceptable. Who deserves rights, who doesn't deserve rights. And I think this creates a question on where we want to go this with this way. So identity politics and diversity politics, they offer, very broadly some ways for change. Of note, right? What tends to happen is that there are big holes, and if we're wanting to fight for a multiracial, multicultural, multi-issue vision for liberation, these type of politics would not really achieve it, is the book's argument. Instead, it's connecting our issues that would achieve that goal. When we're looking at social change, connecting our issues, identifying a common goal for humanity to fight towards, can be a way of achieving that type of vision. So when we fail to connect issues, it prevents us from being able to get a strong coalition and alliance work with other folks. And we know that coalitions and these alliances are made to meet crisis issues. And if we're only focusing on my argument, what I'm providing y'all is a different perspective. So what we've noticed is that when there is focusing on a singular issue, people tend to get left out. People tend to get excluded. And when we separate ourselves by identity or by issues, this tends to prevent us from building a more progressive movement. So taken together, there are pros and cons on working on one issue or multi-issues. And I'm curious, what do y'all think about that? All right, so now we're going to talk about developing a liberatory consciousness. So as just as a quick tidbit, right? Going back to these systems and cycles of socialization, we recognize that we all have a role to play, or we're given a role in this system, right? We learn attitudes, languages, and behaviors that are necessary to function in the existing society. And these learned aspects they are oppressive, right? It prepares us to play the roles of dominant or subordinate in these systems of oppression, right? Men are assigned the role of dominant, and women are assigned the role of subordinate in the system of disequality based on gender. White folks are assigned to play the role of dominant, and folks of color are assigned to play are assigned to play the role of subordinate in the system of disequality based on race. So taken together, it works to the socialization system or the process works to make sure that each person learns their role. If you remember High School Musical a couple years ago, I say a couple, ooh, it's been a long time, doesn't matter. If you remember High School Musical, they sang about the status quo. Stick to the status quo, right? And that's in essence what the socialization process is: teaching people their roles and getting and having them to stick to the status quo. But the thing about that is, at some point, someone does start to question. Um, they question the oppressive systems that they live in. Uh, Now, in doing this liberation work, it's important for us to have several elements, and really this, what we get at this liberatory consciousness. And we're going to talk about what that is, because I know you're wondering, Ms. Mercier, what are you talking about? So liberatory consciousness is this consciousness that allows humans to live their lives in the oppressive systems and institutions with this awareness and intentionality instead of learned and socialized behaviors. So it allows humans to live outside the patterns of thoughts and behaviors that are learned through the socialization process, and helps them, uh, helps them to, uh, or guides them to, engage in behaviors that do not perpetuate oppressive systems. So what are the elements? You have awareness, analysis, action, accountability, and allyship. And we're going to talk about each of these. So awareness. So with awareness, this is the development of a capacity to notice, give your attention to your daily life, your language, behaviors, and thoughts. So taken together, it's making the decision to live your life during the waking, during the waking position. You're giving up that numbness, that dullness, where you've been lulled into going through life. So, for example, when we think about watching certain movies, right? I'll be clear, it's not easy to have this awareness, because when you start pointing things out, you tend to experience stigmatization, right? So, going to the movies, for example, one student may say, or not one student, but a person, when they recognize that, when they have that awareness, they're like, I can't watch this movie anymore because I know too much. So taken together, it's recognizing that something is there and that it makes you uncomfortable, and now it's tough to do something that you once engaged in with no problem. It may be making racist jokes, it may be making sexist jokes, just as examples. Oops. The point is, it's noticing what is happening in the world around you. Now, analysis, right? Analysis is basically where you're thinking about what needs to be done in a given situation. So every human, and I'll be clear, they have a capacity to look at any situation to determine what seems to be true about that situation. And with awareness, it's coupled with awareness where they become the basis of determining whether a change is needed, and if it is, the nature of the change needed. So it's being able to recognize that, hey, here's a problem, and providing, a way, if it is a problem, excuse me. It also means looking at a range of possibilities for actions and even consideration of the results. Action. So this is pretty straightforward. Participation, really. So action is based on the assumption that the participation that we engage in provides the best possibility of gaining liberation for anyone, even yourself. It's deciding what needs to be done and seeing that it does take place. Um, so when we think about a division, right, there can't be a division between those who think and those who put thinking into action. So taken together, a step forward is a step forward. Um, if you move an inch forward, that's still a step forward. So what tends to happen within the liberation work, some people, there might be a law that's put in place for uh, uh, anti-discrimination of natural hair, and that has been taking place. Now, for some folks of note, some folks may say that's not enough. It's not enough for us. Well, it's also important to and while there's this drive, this want for complete liberation, it's important to note that a step forward is a step forward. An inch forward is better than 15 feet backwards. Now, does that mean that you stop demanding for justice when you've only noticed an inch moving forward? No, you continue. And also in doing the work too, it's important to empower other people when they're doing the work themselves. It might be something as simple as reminding others that they are right for the task. Lastly, accountability and allyship. So this is a funny one, because when we think about doing the work and removing ourselves from this oppressive conditioning, we tend to flounder, we tend to get stuck. And I'll be clear, it's really hard when it comes to that conditioning process, right? It's hard to unlearn these behaviors. And to be quite honest, when you live in a system that is designed to have you have certain roles, you don't get information on how to not be in that role. It's really, you're learning for yourself. Now, what does help out is sharing different perspectives. So for, let's say, a white person who is working to extricate themselves from racist conditioning, they may get stuck while working on it. Because their dominant role doesn't provide them with understanding what life might be like outside of that role. A person of color is going to have a different perspective, right? That is unavailable to that white person because of that other person's identity with whiteness. Now, some white folks, they figure it out. In other cases, some don't. In some of those cases, there has been a sharing of perspectives between a white person and a person of color. And what we've seen is that there's this growth and development experienced by not only just the white person, but also by the person of color as well. So taken together, sharing perspectives can provide us with growth and development taken together. So when we engage with a person who was in a dominant role or in a subordinate role, we learn from each other, and we're connecting with each other, right? So there we see that authenticity, right? That engagement and authentic connection. So, oops. With this particular element, it's how we understand and manage the opportunity and possibility for perspective sharing and allyship and liberation work. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. So while folks who have been in subordinate roles, right, they're not required to quote unquote teach. So we've taken this position that it's not the responsibility of members of that group to teach or educate or help to educate members of the dominant group, which does make sense. And it's important to recognize that, because those who bear the brunt of oppression should not be forced or required to take responsibility for eliminating it. And at the same time, it is also notable or noticed that folks in those roles, they can take the lead on setting the world right. So members of that group, they can wait for members of the dominant group to recognize that their language or behavior is oppressive, or they can share their perspective in every place where they could, make that difference. So really, when we think about this as it's either to teach or not to teach, it's where do you want to go with it? Now, I do want to be clear. It doesn't mean that you have to be or should be focusing their attention outward. I'll be clear about that. It's just basically to suggest that when we share perspectives, it can actually move things forward. And something really big in doing this liberation work, and if this is the work where you're moving towards, making mistakes is going to happen. You will be called, if you hold privileged identities and certain oppressions, there is the chance that you will be called that ist. Okay, so for a white person, that might be, and even for other folks, might be called racist. For other people, you might be called heterosexist. You may be called. The point is, you may be called. You may be called out. And when it comes to making mistakes, it's important to have the opportunity and openness to hear from others that allow you to reevaluate that behavior. So, for example, the book says, if a Black person notices another Black person acting out internalized racism, a liberatory consciousness requires that consideration that the usefulness of sharing a viewpoint that allows that person to explore the implications of internalized racist behavior. Accountability really just means that we support each other to learn more about the ways that internalized domination and internalized subordination manifests itself in our lives and how to act to interrupt it. When it comes to accountability, it's a very scary thing to say, I messed up. Being humble is, and I'll throw this in there, being humble is really important in doing this liberation work. Mainly because there is the chance that you will be called that ist. You will make mistakes. That is normal. And it's important. Now, what this does not mean is you go out and purposely call purposely call a Black person the N-word just so they can tell you about yourself. No, don't do that. That's, first off, that's just weird. Second, that's just not nice, right? And when it comes to accepting accountability, it's an elusive topic, specifically in our own individualistic ideology, right? Um, when it comes to saying, I'm sorry, folks have a hard time with saying sorry and accepting responsibility for hurting another person. In our society, specifically within US America, there are very few opportunities and few examples of someone taking full responsibility of their actions. We've seen it in anti-racist literature and anti-racist anti-racist work, right? Where we have seen these scholars call out white folks for being complicit in the subjugation of people of color. And we also have seen a lot of folks, or some of the comments saying, well, I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did not 1,000 years ago, but maybe 400, centuries ago, right? And at the same time, we recognize that white people, for example, still benefit from this system of oppression. And it's not just white people when we look at these oppressions, right? It's anyone who's benefiting from these oppressions. So when it comes to accepting accountability, it's number one, it's hard because we have to do it on our own. There isn't a book or a guide. We don't see these examples in our society, right? A even bigger example is um, when we have seen the not the indictments, we've seen the arresting and charging or the administrative leaves of police officers, and those police officers who have uh, engaged in police brutality, excessive force, and killings of unarmed folks, especially um, unarmed folks of color. What we tend to see is that they go to trial and they are acquitted. That is an example in the ways in which we don't get to see that accountability. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because if I talked all about it, this would be a longer lecture than what it is. Of note, the point of accountability is that we identify it and we say, I messed up. How can I do better? Okay. So taken together, when we look at, just basically to summarize everything, these systems of oppression, they're perpetrated by actions of folks who act automatically on the basis of socialization. So these are just like these conditioned behaviors. And the thing about the socialization process is that it doesn't allow us to act on the basis of what we value. And what I mean, I'm not talking about our personal values, but the values that are provided by this socialization process. And to be quite fair, it doesn't give us a choice. Nobody chooses to be the role of the dominant or the subordinate position. Nobody chooses that. And the system provides us with the values that we're going to work from, that it provides us the values that we live through, and it takes away our choice. So with this development of a liberatory consciousness, it would allow us to have that opportunity of choice to say, here's what I choose to do in my values and my attitudes. This is what I value. And it also has the opportunity to reclaim a choice in our response pattern. So taken together, we've talked a lot about social justice, liberation, and having this liberatory consciousness. And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to social justice advocacy. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the ways in which we can specifically work in social justice advocacy.